I woke up on the bathroom floor, covered in my own vomit. My cheek was pressed against the cold tile, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if it was sweat or something else pooling beneath my chin. My stomach clenched again, but nothing came up. My throat burned, my eyes stung, and I couldn't remember how I got there. I blinked, slowly. The bathroom light had been left on all night. My vision swam, shapes melting into each other. I turned my head and saw my phone lying beside the toilet, face down. Somehow, I reached for it. My fingers trembled as I tapped the screen awake. One new message. It was from my oldest son. The timestamp read 11:48 p.m., just a few hours before sunrise. The message said, "We can't help you right now. Please don't make this harder for us." I read it 3 times. I didn't cry. I didn't feel anything at first. Just a dull, heavy ringing in my ears and the creeping sense that I had finally slipped out of place, like a picture hanging crooked on a wall no one bothers to straighten anymore. They'd gone to the lake. Him and his wife. I remember now, I'd called. I remember leaving a voicemail, trying to keep my voice calm even as my chest tightened. I'd said I wasn't feeling well. That I needed help. That something felt wrong. He must have listened. And then sent that. I stayed there on the floor for what felt like hours. Every part of my body ached, but not in any way the doctors ever warn you about. My bones felt tired. Like they were asking me to stop trying. Like they didn't believe anyone was coming anymore. I tried to sit up, failed. Tried again. Eventually, I propped myself against the cabinet under the sink. I stared at the corner where the tile met the wall. There was dust there. I used to clean every Saturday. Used to make sure the baseboards sparkled. But now the dust just lived there, undisturbed, like it belonged more than I did. I thought about calling him back. Or maybe my daughter. But then I remembered the last time I asked her for something. A ride to a specialist downtown. She'd said they were really swamped right now, with the kids' soccer tournaments. I'd ended up taking 2 buses and waiting in the rain. I caught a cold. She didn't call to check in. No, I couldn't call them again. I wasn't going to beg. I crawled, slowly, toward the hallway. My limbs didn't work right. My hands shook too much to stand. I felt like I was moving underwater. I reached the landline phone near the kitchen counter and somehow pulled it down. My fingers hovered over the numbers. I didn't even know who I was calling at first. It wasn't instinct that brought me to dial 911. It was something smaller, sadder. A realization. I didn't want to die alone on the bathroom floor. That's all. The operator asked my name. My address. I answered her like I was reading a recipe. Detached. Apologetic. She told me to stay on the line. I said I would, but I placed the phone on the tile and leaned my head against the wall again. I didn't want to listen to someone pretending to care. The paramedics arrived 12 minutes later. They knocked, then knocked harder. I managed to croak out, "I'm here," and they broke in. I remember the sound of the door splintering. I remember one of them saying, "Ma'am, can you hear me?" I nodded. Or at least, I think I did. One of them asked, "Do you want us to call your family?" I told him no. I said they were already on their way. That was a lie. A stupid, tired, pitiful lie. But I didn't want the paramedic to feel sorry for me. I didn't want to look like someone who didn't matter. I didn't want to become one of those sad stories nurses whisper about in the break room. They wheeled me into the ambulance. I watched the ceiling pass by in blurs. My fingers gripped the edges of the stretcher like I might fall off, like I had something left to hold on to. In the back of the ambulance, I tried to stay awake. Tried to keep track of time. But everything floated. Everything blurred. Somewhere between my street and the hospital, I started remembering things. Not loud memories. Just little moments. My son when he was 5, hiding under the dining table with a crayon, drawing on the wall. My daughter asking me to stay beside her bed during thunderstorms. Their laughter when I used to make pancakes in animal shapes. Their tiny hands holding mine. How light they were. I wondered when they stopped seeing me as someone who held them, and started seeing me as someone they had to carry. The hospital was bright and humming. They asked me questions, poked needles into my veins, checked machines I didn't understand. I answered what I could. I nodded when they told me I'd had a mild neurological event. They didn't say stroke at first. They tried to soften it. I could tell. But I've lived long enough to know when something is serious. I could see it in the way the nurse avoided my eyes. They put a hospital bracelet on my wrist. The plastic dug into my skin. I didn't take it off, not even when it got itchy. Somehow, it felt like proof that I still existed. That someone, somewhere, had documented that I'd been alive at that moment. I asked if I could keep it when they discharged me later. They thought it was a sentimental thing. But really, I needed something to remind me I'd made it through. That my body had cried for help, and someone had answered, even if it was just a stranger in a uniform. No one visited. The first night, I stayed awake, staring at the chair by the window. Hospitals always have one. That visitor chair that's too stiff to sit in but too hopeful to remove. Mine stayed empty. I thought about calling again. I even typed a message to my daughter. But I didn't send it. I imagined what she might say. And I deleted it. I thought about how many times I had shown up for them. Not just the big things. Not just graduations and weddings. But the small, hidden sacrifices. Canceling my own dentist appointment so I could watch the grandkids. Taking out a second credit card so they could fix their car. Staying up all night on the couch, just in case they called. They never asked me to. But they always expected I would. When you give that much, you expect something will remain. That the love you poured in will settle somewhere. But I was starting to realize love isn't always stored in places we think. Sometimes it just evaporates. The second day, a nurse came in and asked again if I wanted to list any emergency contacts. I said no. She raised an eyebrow, hesitated, then nodded politely and left. I wanted to tell her I wasn't alone, that I had children, that I was a mother, but the words wouldn't come out, because I wasn't sure it was true anymore. By the third day, I stopped expecting the door to open. I watched the light move across the wall. I listened to the heart monitor. I counted how many times they changed the 4-bag. Small things, quiet things. And I thought about the moment I had first become invisible. Not now. Not last week. Years ago. I remembered one Thanksgiving. I had cooked for hours. Set the table just right. My son's wife had come in, looked around, and said, "You didn't have to go overboard." I smiled and said, "It's no trouble." But I remember that sinking feeling. Like I'd brought too much of myself into a room that didn't want me. It had been like that for a long time. 1,000 tiny cuts I never tended to. I used to think that love meant giving. Giving again. And again. Until they noticed. Until they said thank you. But now I know, that kind of love isn't noble. It's exhausting. And sometimes, it's not even seen. On the morning they discharged me, I packed my bag slowly. They offered to call a family member to pick me up. I smiled and said I'd already arranged a ride. Another lie. I walked out of the hospital with my plastic bag of discharge papers, the hospital bracelet still on my wrist, and a cab receipt I had to pay in cash. The cab driver didn't talk. I was grateful for that. I stared out the window the whole way home. The sky was pale. The city looked gray and too wide. I felt small in it. When we pulled up to my house, I sat in the car for a moment too long. My hands wouldn't open the door right away. My legs didn't want to move. I looked at the front steps and thought, what am I walking back into? The house didn't feel like mine anymore. It was quiet, cold, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful. I stood in the entryway, alone. My phone buzzed. A spam text. Nothing from them. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't just alone. I had been left. There's a difference. Alone can be chosen. Left means someone saw you and walked away anyway. I made tea. I sat in the kitchen without turning on the lights. The tea got cold. That night, I held the hospital bracelet in my hand for a long time before I placed it in the top drawer beside my bed. I thought, I might need this. To remember. To remember what it felt like to matter to strangers more than to my own blood. To remember that I survived the moment I realized I wasn't anyone's priority. To remember that the next time I start to forget my own worth. Because I almost didn't make it. And they didn't even notice. The nurse said I had a mild stroke. She asked if I wanted her to call someone. I said, no need. They already know. She didn't ask again. It was the way she nodded that stayed with me. Not judgmental, not cruel. Just resigned. Like she'd heard it before. Like too many mothers sit in those beds with children who know, but don't come. They moved me to a quieter floor that second night. The hallway smelled of bleach and something floral that couldn't quite mask the sadness of everything. There were 2 empty beds in my room, and 1 chair that faced the window. I sat in that chair when I could, watching the nurses pass by. None of them looked in. No one stopped. It was a strange thing, being in a place full of people and still being so completely forgotten. I kept staring at the 4 drip, the way it pulsed and blinked. That little green light beside the monitor. It reminded me of the nightlight I used to plug in for my daughter when she was little. She hated the dark. I would sit on the edge of her bed while she drifted off, promising to stay there for just a few more minutes. I never left before she was asleep. Never. I don't know why that memory came to me then. Maybe because the beeping of the machine felt like a metronome to grief. Maybe because it was easier to think of bedtime stories than the silence in my phone. They knew where I was. That was the part one couldn't make peace with. It wasn't like they didn't know. I had called. I had left a voicemail. My son had replied. They knew I was sick. Knew I was alone. And still, they went to the lake. I pictured them, laughing over wine, maybe grilling something. I could see my daughter-in-law scrolling through her phone, ignoring my name on the screen. My grandchildren splashing around. Maybe someone said, "Should we check on Mom?" And someone else said, "She always makes it about her," and they all just moved on. I don't think I've ever felt smaller than I did in that hospital bed, listening to the sounds of machines keeping time in a room where no one visited. I thought maybe they'd surprise me. Day 2, I checked the hallway every time a cart squeaked by. I wondered if maybe my daughter had taken the afternoon off. If maybe one of the boys had driven in early. Maybe I'd look up and see a familiar face, and we'd laugh about the voicemail and the timing and how it had all just been a misunderstanding. But no one came. I looked at the chair by the window again. Still empty. Always empty. It was worse at night. That's when the walls got quiet. That's when you hear everything you wish you hadn't thought about. The nurse came in to check my vitals and I asked her what time it was. She said it was just after midnight. I nodded like it meant something. Midnight. It had been 3 days since anyone I raised had asked if I was okay. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last time we were all together. Maybe Thanksgiving, 2 years ago. Before they started talking about needing space. Before I started noticing how I always sat at the end of the table, near the kitchen, away from the laughter. I used to be the one who carved the turkey. Now I was just the one who cooked it. That year, my son told me I didn't need to bring anything, that they'd take care of everything. I showed up with pie anyway. No one touched it. They had store-bought desserts lined up on the counter like I didn't exist. That pie stayed in my fridge for 3 weeks. I kept thinking someone would drop by to ask for a slice. No one did. That's the kind of memory that visits you when you're lying in a hospital bed, for in your arm, watching your blood pressure numbers climb and fall like a heartbeat on screen. I didn't call anyone on the 3rd day. I think I stopped waiting sometime during the 2nd night. There's a place you get to, after all the bargaining, where you stop hoping. You just observe, like you're watching your own life from behind glass. I noticed things. The way the shadows stretched across the floor at 4 a.m. The way the cleaning lady sang under her breath. The way the hospital food trays always came with a square of Jell-O that no one ate. I remember thinking how much time we spend putting things in place for people who won't appreciate them. I thought about the years I spent organizing birthday parties, packing lunches, cutting sandwiches into shapes. I used to keep a calendar just for their appointments. I had alarms set for everything. Recitals, games, orthodontist visits. They don't even know that, probably. They think things just happened. That things were always ready, always clean, always filled. But that was me. I was the one who ran through the rain to get snacks for class parties. I was the one who stayed up to sew last-minute costumes. I was the one who took off work, who gave up weekends, who sold my wedding ring to cover my daughter's first rent check when her job fell through. I gave them my time, my savings, my energy, my quiet. And when I was the one who needed help, I got a message. We can't help you right now. Please don't make this harder for us. I read it again that 3rd day, opened the message and stared at it. Not just, we can't, but, please don't make this harder. As if my sickness, my asking for help, was a burden. As if I should have had the decency to disappear quietly. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. I felt my face go hot. Not with anger. Not even sadness. Just shame. Just the deep, echoing understanding that I had outlived my usefulness to them. They weren't cruel. At least not in ways the world could see. They didn't yell. They didn't hit. They didn't steal from me. They just stopped seeing me. And that, I think, is worse. When someone chooses to hurt you, you can name it. You can call it betrayal. But when someone just stops acknowledging your pain, your presence, there's nothing to hold on to. It's a kind of erasure. Like you're being slowly erased from the story you helped write. The nurse asked me if I had anyone picking me up. I told her I'd arranged a ride. That was the 3rd lie. There was no one. I hadn't told anyone I was being discharged. I hadn't told anyone I was still alive. I changed back into the clothes I'd worn to the ER. They smelled stale. My sweater had a stain I hadn't noticed before. I brushed it off quietly, trying not to let my hands shake. They gave me a folder with papers. Blood work. Discharge notes. Instructions. I thanked the nurse. She didn't know what else to say. I didn't blame her. The walk down the hospital corridor felt longer than I remembered. Like I was walking through all the years I had given away. All the birthdays. All the tears. All the silent nights spent waiting up for children who never knew I was waiting. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped out into the sunlight. It hurt my eyes. The world hadn't stopped moving. I hailed a cab. The driver didn't speak. I was grateful. I didn't want to explain anything. I didn't want to tell him that I had been erased by the very people I had built my life around. I didn't want to say out loud that I had been in a hospital bed for 3 nights without a single visit, call, or text. That kind of silence becomes its own language. And I was fluent now. At home, I climbed the steps slowly. Each step a reminder of the body that had betrayed me. Each breath a reminder that I was still here, even if they wished I wasn't. Inside, the air was stale. No one had been there. No dishes moved. No lights on timers. No mail taken in. It was like the house knew what I was feeling. I walked past the family photos on the wall. Stopped in front of one. Christmas, 10 years ago. My son's arm around my shoulder. My daughter laughing in the background. I stared at it like I was looking at strangers. Who were those people? Who was I to them? I took the photo down, placed it face down in the drawer with the others I had meant to sort through. I couldn't throw them out yet, but I couldn't bear to see them either. In my bedroom, I opened the nightstand drawer, placed the hospital bracelet inside, on top of an old Mother's Day card with no date on it. That drawer was starting to feel like a museum of forgotten things, of proof that I had once been needed, once been loved. Maybe. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to breathe. Deep, slow. The kind they teach you in the hospital. I wanted to feel something. Anger, grief, even relief. But I just felt empty. And the worst part? I understood. I understood why they didn't come. Because I had made it easy to forget me. I had never asked for anything, never insisted, never made noise, never demanded space. I had loved them so quietly, they forgot I had a voice at all. That night, I slept with the light on, not because I was afraid, but because for the first time in a long time, I didn't want to dream. I just wanted to rest. When I walked in, I smelled paint. Not fresh, not pleasant. Chemical. Sharp. It took a moment for me to place it. I set down the grocery bag with the prescriptions I'd picked up. The house was too quiet again. Too clean. The kind of clean that feels like a warning. My son and his wife had promised I could recover at their house. It had been the plan for over 6 months. We'd talked about it last fall, when I was still helping with school pickups and folding their laundry. I remember my daughter-in-law standing in the doorway with her mug of tea, saying, "You don't need your own place, really. We've got the space. It just makes sense now that you're retired." Retired. I didn't correct her. I hadn't retired. I'd been replaced, pushed out, let go when they automated the department. But I let her use the word. It made it sound less like a failure, more like a choice. She made everything sound like it was for my benefit. So thoughtful, so generous. So I packed up my 1-bedroom apartment, gave notice, donated furniture. I even paid the lease-breaking fee myself, because I trusted them, because I thought this was what family did, what I had always done. The house smelled like fresh paint because the room they'd promised me, the guest room, the one with the soft blue curtains I'd helped pick out, was gone. I stood in the hallway, holding the door frame, and looked inside. Empty. The bed was gone. The dresser. The closet was bare. The walls had been repainted beige. Sterile. Neutral. A folding desk sat where the bed had been. A rolling chair. A bookshelf with 3 matching binders. My daughter-in-law walked past me, holding a laundry basket. She didn't even pause. Just said, "Oh yeah, we had to convert it to an office. With the hybrid schedule, I need a place to take calls." I said nothing. What could I say? I stood there, disoriented, not just by the change, but by the ease of it. Like they hadn't even hesitated. Like my presence had never mattered enough to slow them down. I turned slowly, stepped back down the hallway, and sat at the kitchen table. My legs were trembling, but I didn't let them see it. My son came in a few minutes later. He had that tone he uses when he's trying to smooth things over. Gentle, condescending, polished. He said, "It's just temporary. We're still figuring things out. I nodded. I said I understood. But inside, something was folding up. Small and sharp. The part of me that still believed I had a place in their world. Later that evening, they offered to set up a cot in the laundry room. I smiled. Said I'd think about it. But I knew I wouldn't stay. That night, while they were watching TV in the living room, I slipped quietly into the garage and retrieved the old suitcase I'd kept in the back corner. It still had some of my clothes inside, folded neatly from the move. Things I hadn't unpacked yet. Things I wasn't sure they wanted me to bring. I packed in silence. The kind of silence that aches. The next morning, I left before the sun was up. I didn't leave a note. I didn't text. I didn't slam any doors. I just walked away. The bus station was quiet. A woman with a mop was cleaning near the entrance. I sat on the cold metal bench and stared at the arrival board. I didn't know where I was going yet. I just needed to not be there. I took the bus 3 towns over. Not far. Just far enough. Checked into a motel that didn't ask too many questions. Paid cash. I sat on the edge of the stiff bed and stared at the floral bedspread, thinking about the guest room. The one that used to be mine. The one with the curtains I had picked out. I wondered where those curtains were now. In storage. Donated. Or thrown away like I had been. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't sad. But because I didn't have the energy for grief anymore. Grief takes strength. And I was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. The motel room had a little desk, a plastic chair, and a nightstand with a broken drawer. There was a TV bolted to the wall, but I never turned it on. I didn't want noise. I wanted quiet that I could trust. I sat with that quiet for a long time. Long enough to feel the weight of everything I'd carried for years start to shift. That night, I took out the envelope I always kept at the bottom of my bag. Inside were copies of receipts, rent payments, utility bills, textbooks, credit transfers, old wire transfers. I'd saved them all. I spread them out on the bed. The paper smelled faintly of old ink and perfume. I wasn't even sure why I had kept them. Maybe to remind myself that it had been real. That my sacrifices weren't imagined. That I had done something. That I had mattered. For 25 years, I had been their emergency fund. Their backup plan. Their late-night call when something broke or fell through. I had paid phone bills, insurance deductibles, speeding tickets, down payments. Quietly. Without fanfare. Sometimes they said thank you. Sometimes they didn't. But I never expected much. Just a place. A seat at the table I had helped build. Now even that had been repainted and repurposed. I sat there for hours, looking at the papers. Some were faded. Some had smiley faces scribbled in the corner. My way of making bills feel less heavy. I thought about throwing them out. But I couldn't. Not yet. I folded them back into the envelope and placed it beneath the motel pillow, like a ghost I wasn't ready to release. The next morning, I walked around the unfamiliar town. My legs still ached from the hospital stay, but I needed to move. Needed to see something that didn't remind me of them. I passed a bakery on the corner. The sign was hand-painted, the letters slightly crooked. The windows were fogged from the ovens. It smelled like cinnamon and flour and something soft I hadn't felt in weeks. I stood outside for a long time, just breathing it in. Then I stepped inside. The woman behind the counter was older, maybe my age. Her hair was pinned up, her hands dusted with flour. She didn't ask where I came from. Didn't ask why I looked like I hadn't slept in days. She just smiled and said, "Coffee?" I nodded. She poured it into a mug without asking if I wanted cream or sugar. Like she knew I just needed something warm in my hands. There was a small table near the window. I sat there and sipped slowly, watching people pass. For a few minutes, I didn't feel invisible. When the woman came back, she asked if I lived nearby. I said I was passing through. She nodded again, like that made perfect sense. Then she said, "If you're looking for a little work, I could use help with mornings. Just a few hours. Nothing fancy." I blinked. I hadn't asked. But she offered anyway. That was the first kindness I'd felt in a long time that didn't come with guilt or expectation. I said yes. She handed me an apron, told me to come in at 6 the next morning. And just like that, I had something. It wasn't much, but it was mine. That afternoon, I asked the motel manager if they had a long-stay option. He said no, but he pointed me toward a woman who rented rooms above her store. That woman turned out to be the same one from the bakery. She laughed when I asked. Said, "If you can sweep floors and feed the cat, the room's yours." It was small. The wallpaper peeled in places. The ceiling leaked when it rained. The mattress was thin. But the window opened. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. That night, I unpacked my bag, hung my sweaters on a shared rod, placed the envelope of receipts in the drawer beside the bed. And I slept. Really slept. No hospital machines. No unanswered messages. No guest room turned into an office. Just quiet. Just air. Just me. The smell of flour became familiar again. Every morning, I tied the same apron around my waist and swept the same patch of tile where the door swung open. The bell above the frame jingled every time someone came in. Small, regular reminders that the world was still moving. The woman who owned the bakery, Elaine, never asked too many questions. She spoke softly, gave direction gently, and never made me feel like I was in the way. That, in itself, was a kind of healing I hadn't expected. My hands remembered how to fold dough, how to measure without thinking. I didn't talk much, but I listened. Customers came in and told their stories while they waited, about kids and jobs and the weather, as if we were old friends. And slowly, something inside me stopped bracing for disappointment. In the evenings, I'd go upstairs to my little room. The cat, Milo, would sit on my windowsill, watching birds. I'd make tea, stare at the quiet town below, and write lists on scraps of paper I never kept. Just little things. Groceries. Questions. Words I wanted to say but never did. I stopped checking my phone. I didn't delete their numbers, but I muted their message threads. Not out of anger. Just acceptance. Sometimes letting go isn't a door slammed shut. It's a drawer that you stop opening. I still kept the envelope in that drawer, the one full of old receipts. I didn't look at it often, but I knew it was there. Some nights, I'd sit at the little desk and run my fingers over it like I needed to remind myself it wasn't all in my head. That the life I'd lived, the years I'd poured into others, had weight. Elaine offered me full-time hours after the first month. I hesitated. It had been so long since someone had wanted me for more. She must have seen the question in my face, because she said, "Only if you want to. You're not a project here. You're part of it." I nodded, not trusting my voice. That night, I walked to the park at the edge of town. Just sat on the bench beneath the birch trees and listened to the wind through the branches. It sounded like breathing, like something exhaling around me. I hadn't realized how often I'd been holding mine. The days took on a rhythm. Morning dough, midday sweeping, evening stillness. There was a quiet beauty in it. I started collecting little things again. Not for anyone else. Just for me. A stone I found shaped like a heart. A pressed flower from the trail behind the bakery. A packet of sugar with a quote printed on the side. It said, "The tree that bends does not break." I kept that one. I taped it inside the drawer next to the envelope, right above the folded receipts. There were still bad days. Days when I'd see a mother with her grown children and feel a sharp twist in my stomach. Days when I'd hear a voicemail alert and instinctively reach for my phone, only to find it empty. But they passed. And that, too, was something I learned to honor. Healing doesn't always look like happiness. Sometimes it looks like walking past the bakery window and not flinching when you see a child who looks like your daughter used to. Sometimes it looks like not needing to explain where you've been. One afternoon, I was cleaning out a cupboard in the bakery when I found an old photo album tucked behind a stack of paper napkins. Elaine was busy at the register. I brought it upstairs with me, meaning to return it later. But when I sat down on the bed and opened it, I found faces I didn't recognize. Smiling couples, children holding cupcakes, birthday candles frozen mid-glow. The last page had a photo of Elaine, much younger, holding a cake beside a man in a flannel shirt. Her hair was longer, her eyes softer, maybe. But for all the befores I had lost. For the weddings I attended with a smile and an empty wallet. For the holidays I hosted alone in the kitchen while everyone else laughed in the living room. For the years I spent pouring myself into people who had never once asked me how I was really doing. The crying didn't last long. But it was the kind that empties you, that makes room for something else. I returned the album the next morning. Elaine took it from me without speaking, just nodded. There was a long pause between us, and then she said, "We carry things, don't we?" I nodded back, and we never spoke of it again. That was the thing about Elaine. She didn't need to know everything to know me. One Sunday morning, while I was mixing batter, a man walked in holding a newspaper. Middle-aged. Quiet smile. He asked if we had anything left warm. I handed him a cinnamon roll straight from the tray. He paid in cash and left a tip without looking at me. The next Sunday he came back. Then the next. His name was Thomas. He taught literature at the local college and lived with his sister. He liked his coffee black and his pastries simple. He never asked about my past. But he noticed things. When my hands were stiff from the cold, he left a small bottle of lotion beside the register. When I was quiet, he let it be. Once, he told me a story about a tree in his backyard that bloomed every other year. "Even nature gets tired," he said. "It doesn't make it any less beautiful." I think that was the first compliment I'd accepted in years. Not because it was grand, but because it didn't ask anything of me. I started walking with him to the corner after work. Just to talk. Just to listen. Sometimes that's all you need. Someone to walk with you. No questions. No agenda. Just presence. One evening, as we stood outside, he said, "You seem like someone who's carrying a lot you don't talk about." I looked at him for a long time. Then I said, "I used to be a mother." He didn't blink. Just said, "You still are." I shook my head. No. I was a mother when I mattered. Now I'm just a name in their phone they don't press. Thomas didn't argue. He just said, "Maybe. Or maybe you're more than what they chose to forget." I didn't reply. But I carried that sentence with me for days. More than what they chose to forget. I had never let myself think that way. I had defined myself by what I gave, what I did, what I sacrificed. But maybe I was more than the void they left behind. Maybe I was not just the gap, but the ground. That night, I took out the envelope again, spread out the receipts one last time, and then, quietly, I let them go. I didn't rip them, didn't burn them. I just folded them one by one and placed them in a paper bag, walked to the park and left them in the recycling bin. Not out of spite, but out of peace, because I didn't need proof anymore. I was the proof. My survival. My stillness. My breath. My quiet joy. That was the evidence. That was the revenge, if you could even call it that. Not the kind that shouts, the kind that lives. That was the night I wrote the letter. Not to them, to myself. It said, I forgive you for giving too much, for waiting too long, for staying when you should have walked away. I forgive you for not knowing you deserved more. And I promise you this, you will never again beg to belong. I folded it carefully, placed it in the drawer where the envelope used to be, and I slept better than I had in years. It was nearly 6 months before I heard from my daughter again. The message came through while I was folding dish towels in the bakery, the kind of ordinary afternoon where the air smells like vanilla and the light through the window hits just right. I didn't even hear the phone buzz at first. It was Elaine who pointed to it, her flour-covered finger leaving a little smudge on the screen. I wiped it clean, and then I saw her name. 3 words. Are you okay? Not, where are you? Not, we miss you. Not, I'm sorry. Just that. I stared at it until my eyes burned. The towels stayed half-folded on the counter. The batter for the cupcakes sat still in the bowl. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I turned the phone over. Let the message rest face down on the table. I went back to folding towels, slower this time, more deliberate, like I needed to touch something real again. I don't know what I had expected. An apology, maybe, or at least an acknowledgement of how long it had been. But all I got was a sentence that barely scratched the surface of everything they had let me go through. And still, something inside me cracked open a little. Because for all its inadequacy, it was still a sign. She had remembered me. Later that night, I sat by the window in my little room and replayed the message in my mind. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Not yet. I wasn't ready to open the door again, not even a crack. Because I knew how that story went. I'd walk back in. I'd patch things up. I'd tell myself it was better than nothing. And slowly, quietly, I'd disappear all over again. The next morning, I deleted the message. Not out of anger, but because I needed to choose myself this time. I had learned something in that quiet bakery, in that little upstairs room where the walls creaked and the radiator rattled like a heartbeat. I had learned how to live without begging for space in someone else's life. I had learned how to sit in silence and feel whole. One afternoon, Thomas brought me a book of poems. Nothing fancy. Just something he said reminded him of me. I flipped through it slowly, not really reading, just letting the rhythm of the lines settle around me. There was a line that stuck out. Some things bloom only in exile. I copied that line onto a note card and taped it to the wall beside my bed. I didn't know what I was blooming into, but I knew it was mine. A few weeks later, I started volunteering at the community library. Just shelving books, helping children with crafts, organizing the dusty archives in the back. It was quiet work. Gentle work. One of the librarians gave me a little name tag. It said M. She didn't ask what it stood for, and I didn't offer. Because in that place, I wasn't a forgotten mother or a burden or a retired nobody. I was just M. And that was enough. I started signing notes that way, M. Started writing short entries in a little blue journal I kept in the top drawer. Just observations. Thoughts. Things I never had space for before. Milo curled up in the bakery window today. Thomas said the rain smells like stories. Ellen hummed while kneading bread, sounded like my mother. These small things became anchors, proof that I existed, that I saw, that I mattered, even if only to myself. Sometimes, when the ache crept back in, because it still did, I would walk the long path behind the library where the trees leaned in toward each other like old friends. I'd sit on the bench at the far end and close my eyes. I imagined I was a tree. Not the grand kind, not the one in front of the house everyone notices, but the quiet one at the edge of the forest. The one no one names but everyone leans on. And I would think to myself, maybe being unseen isn't the worst thing. Maybe the quiet ones are the ones who hold the world up. It was spring when the letter arrived. Not an email. Not a text. A real letter, addressed in my son's handwriting, forwarded to the bakery through a shared account I had left behind. Elaine handed it to me carefully. No questions. I took it upstairs and sat on the bed, turning the envelope over in my hands like it might whisper to me. It smelled faintly like his cologne. I almost didn't open it, but eventually I did. It was short. He said they had looked for me, that they didn't understand why I had left, that the kids missed me. He said he knew they had mishandled things. That was the word he used. Mishandled. As if I were a delivery box that had been dropped. He asked me to come for dinner. Said they were hosting a barbecue. Said it wouldn't be the same without me. There was no apology. No ownership of what they had done. Just a soft suggestion that I resume my role, my place, quietly, like always. I folded the letter carefully. I didn't cry. I just stared out the window for a long time, watching the wind move through the branches. And then I wrote a letter of my own. I didn't send it. I placed it in the drawer, next to the poem, above the journal. It said, I am not angry, but I am not available. I am no longer the bridge you burn and expect to cross again. I was never the silence you mistook for consent. I am a whole life, and I will not shrink to fit the space you offer. I sealed it, dated it, let it be enough. That week, I took down the old photos I'd kept in the drawer. The ones I had moved from house to house, apartment to apartment. Photos of birthdays and graduations and trips where I had stood just outside the frame, holding jackets and purses. I went to the lake one morning, early before the families arrived, and I let the photos go. Not in anger, not as revenge, but as release. I watched them float briefly before sinking, and then I walked away. I didn't look back. That day, I stopped calling it starting over. It wasn't starting over. It was starting finally. That evening, Elaine offered me the upstairs apartment full-time. Said I could paint the walls if I wanted. Choose curtains. I said yes. I chose yellow ones. Not because yellow was my favorite, but because it reminded me of mornings. Of the ones still ahead. I bought a new journal. And on the first page, I wrote, I paid their bills for 25 years. And now, finally, I am paying attention to my own life. That was the beginning, not of a new chapter, but of the book I was always meant to write. Quietly, softly, for me. I don't count the years anymore, not the ones I lost. Not the ones I gave away like second helpings on a dinner plate. Not even the ones I'm finally living now. Time doesn't move in a straight line when your life has been broken and rebuilt. It folds. It loops. It hides in corners you forget to dust. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and don't remember what day it is, but I always know where I am. And more importantly, who I am. I am not the mother who gave too much. I am the woman who finally stopped giving herself away. Elaine retired in the spring. She left the bakery in my hands with a quiet blessing and a tin of handwritten recipes. Her hands were shaking a little as she passed it to me, but her eyes were steady. You keep the place warm, she said. You know how. And I did. Not just with ovens or cinnamon or soft light in the early morning, but with the quietness that lets people breathe. The kind that makes strangers feel like they've come home even if no one's waiting for them. That's what I had built. Not a business. Not a new life. But a sanctuary. A place where I wasn't a placeholder or a last resort or a forgotten obligation. Thomas still comes every Sunday. He brings a newspaper and leaves it folded in half like a secret. Sometimes we talk. Sometimes we don't. He understands the beauty of not filling every silence. A few months ago, he asked if I'd ever consider visiting my family. I looked at him for a long time, then said, "They would have to meet me where I am now, and I don't think they know the way." He didn't push. He just nodded and poured more coffee. Some weeks later, I received a second letter, this time from my youngest daughter. The handwriting was softer, unsure, like she had rewritten it too many times. She said she found my name on a community flyer someone had posted online about the bakery. She said she was glad to know I was okay, that she had been worried, that she missed me. She didn't ask me to come back. She didn't mention what had happened. She just said, "I hope you're somewhere that loves you back." That was the first time I cried in a long time. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't feel like a rope pulling me back. It felt like a ribbon. Soft. Optional. A small kindness that didn't ask for anything in return. I didn't reply. Not yet. But I took the letter upstairs and placed it in a drawer next to the poem about the tree. I even added something else. A photo. Not of them. Not of me back then. Just a picture one of the bakery girls took, me in the window, holding a coffee mug, smiling at something no one else could see. That was the version of me I wanted to remember. That was the version I had fought to find. The seasons changed again. The upstairs apartment got a fresh coat of paint, soft cream with yellow undertones. I picked it out myself, standing in the hardware store holding swatches like talismans. The curtain rods were uneven, and the windows still creaked, but it felt like mine. Every Sunday afternoon, I walked to the lake again. It wasn't far. I didn't go to remember. I went to forget. To wash the week from my skin and let the wind remind me I still had a body that could feel things. Cool air. Warm sun. The slight sting of gravel under my shoes. One day in late summer, a woman stopped me there. She had gray in her hair and a tiredness around her eyes that I recognized like a mirror. She said, "Do you live here?" I nodded. She asked if the town was kind. I said, "It's quiet." And she smiled in that way people do when they understand too much without needing words. She sat down beside me on the bench and took out a photo from her bag. It was bent at the edges, loved too long. "That's my daughter," she said. "I haven't seen her in 3 years." I didn't ask why. I just looked at the photo. Then I said, "She still looks like she needs you, even if she doesn't know it." The woman nodded. And for the next hour, we sat without speaking. Two mothers who had walked too far without ever being seen. I never learned her name. But that wasn't the point. Sometimes healing isn't about rebuilding old bridges. It's about lighting a candle for someone else trying to find their shore. That night, I opened my old phone. It had been sitting in a drawer, untouched. I used a prepaid flip phone now. Simple. Quiet. No scrolling. Just calling. But I plugged the old one in. Waited for it to come to life. The screen lit up slowly, the way something reluctant does. There were messages. A few missed calls. A voicemail. I sat very still as I pressed play. My daughter's voice filled the room. She was crying. She said, "I didn't know how to help. I didn't know what you needed. I thought maybe if I stayed back, you'd come around. I didn't think you'd leave for good. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." It wasn't new, but it was enough. I didn't save the voicemail. I didn't delete it, either. I let it stay in that space between memory and choice. I turned off the phone and placed it back in the drawer. Not everything needs to be acted on. Some things just need to be held. The bakery grew busier as the fall arrived. People came in for pumpkin bread, for warmth, for familiarity. I began recognizing faces, names. I began being recognized, not for what I had done, but for who I had become. One day, a little boy pointed at me and said, "She's the lady who makes the cinnamon things." His mother smiled and said, "He talks about you all week." I laughed, but something caught in my throat. It had been so long since someone looked at me like I was something to look forward to. I started writing again, not just journal entries, but small stories, moments, little truths I couldn't say out loud. I wrote about hospital lights, about guest rooms turned into offices, about the silence of a mother standing on the porch with nowhere to go. But I also wrote about yellow curtains, about dough that rises if you give it time, about women who start again, not because they're brave, but because they're tired of disappearing. I didn't share them. Not yet. They were mine. Proof that I still had a voice, that I hadn't been erased completely. Sometimes people ask me if I miss my children, and the truth is, I miss who I thought they were. I miss the idea of them, but not the way they made me feel. Not the hollow. Not the obligation. Not the way they only called when something broke. I still love them. I always will. But that love no longer demands anything of me. It no longer ties me to pain. It just exists. Softly. Quietly. Like wind moving through the bakery window. There's a box beneath my bed now. Inside are all the letters I wrote and never sent. The first one says, "You left me on the bathroom floor." The last one says, "And I got up without you." That's how the story ends. Not with a reunion, not with a reckoning, but with a woman standing at a counter, hands in flour, smiling at strangers who see her. Not for what she can give, but for who she is. I am not angry anymore. I am not grieving. I am just here. Alive. Still rising. And that is enough.